Now, taurine is a unique amino acid for several reasons. Number one, unlike other amino acids, it doesn't form protein. So all the other amino acids that we talk about connect with each other to form longer chains of different proteins that have different functions. But taurine doesn't do that. It stands alone, and we'll talk about some of its functions shortly. It's produced in small amounts by the body, and we'll show you how that's done. It was discovered in 1827 by German scientists. It was discovered originally in ox bile, which is why the name taurine, which comes from Latin tauros, which means bull. So it gets its name from where it was originally discovered in ox bile. Now, it's conditionally essential. The body can produce it in small amounts, but under conditions of high stress or chronic disease and inflammation, and in infants, the body needs more. And so in those cases, it has to come from food. You can't make enough or synthesize enough to get the necessary amounts to sustain healthy function. Okay, let's blow up on the screen here and let's talk about how taurine is produced in the body. So if you look at this diagram here, we've got several different pathways that I want to point out, but one, we can make taurine from the amino acid cysteine. And so what happens is cysteine goes through some different conversions biochemically to form hypotaurine and then subsequently to form taurine here. Now we can also make taurine from the amino acid methionine. So cysteine and methionine are two amino acids we get predominantly from eating animal meats and sulfur-containing foods, both of which make taurine. But you can see here with methionine, in order to properly make taurine, that requires vitamin B12 and folate, which is vitamin B9. So if you're vitamin B12 or folate deficient, maybe you have plenty of methionine, but with these types of deficiencies, you can run into a problem with taurine synthesis. And the same is true when your body is trying to make taurine from cysteine, as you see here, L-cysteine in the center. Well, to get to taurine, which is down here, again, these biochemical pathways are somewhat complex looking, but really what I want you to know is we go from cysteine to taurine, and you'll see in blue, in these small letters here, so that you can see the smaller blue text, that says pyridoxal 5-phosphate. In essence, that is vitamin B6. So in order to make taurine from L-cysteine, you have to have adequate quantities of vitamin B6, and if you don't, you run into a problem. And you can see you can get there several different ways. The body has redundancies built into it, so you can get to taurine going around the block, so to speak. Also, this mechanism requires pyridoxal 5-phosphate, otherwise known as vitamin B6, or you can come just straight down and get to it through that mechanism, also requiring B6. Now, if you go up further, we talked about methionine earlier. This is methionine, S-adenosyl methionine. Methionine has to basically cycle into homocysteine, and you can see for homocysteine to turn into cysteine, that also requires B6, pyridoxal 5-phosphate. All right, so all that confusing chemistry aside, the key takeaway here is your body requires vitamin B6 to make taurine, and there are multiple different steps where you need B6. And if you don't have it, if your vitamin B6 is too low, you're going to have a hard time making taurine. Now keep that in mind, because as we get into some of the functions and why taurine is important and what it does, it's going to make a lot more sense. So again, you need B6, you need B12, you need folate to produce taurine internally. So if your body is trying to synthesize its own taurine, you got to have those B vitamins in order for that to happen. And if you don't, you're out of business, and then you're going to struggle with a lot of the diseases and other problems that are associated with low levels of taurine. Well, let's look at tissue concentrations in humans. So if you look at this diagram, this shows us where we find taurine in human tissues, the highest quantities. And these quantities are micromoles per gram. But you can see here the retina, which is in the eye, has the largest concentration, at least on the top. Now, there's some newer research showing that the leukocytes, there's leukocytes, just another way of saying white blood cell, can contain up to, so they're saying 20 to 35 in this diagram, but some saying up to 50. So leukocytes are another key concentrated area where we need taurine, and taurine regulates immune function, and that's why, again, when we see where taurine is stacked, that should give you a good indication of if it's stacked at a high level in that tissue needs more of it. So we see it in thrombocytes, which are platelets. So this would be things like blood clotting. We see a lot of taurine in the spleen. We see it in high concentrations in the heart and in muscle tissue, as well as kidney, lung, brain, liver, and erythrocytes. This would be a red blood cell. So now when we're talking about the fluids of the body, breast milk has a high concentration. That's because the developing fetus, the developing babies, not the fetus, the babies require large amounts of taurine for brain development. We see a lot of it in bile. As a matter of fact, taurine is responsible for producing bile. That's why there's so much taurine in bile. We see some in the plasma and serum. We see smaller amounts in the saliva and cerebrospinal fluid, and then minute amounts in the sweat directly. So that's where we find taurine in the body. So let's take that into account as we explore the key functions or the key roles of taurine. So the first being bile salt formation. Taurine conjugates with bile acids, aiding in fat absorption and digestion. Now, where does this apply? Let's break this down a little bit so that you can understand it. So here we have taurine. This is your liver because this is where bile is produced. So you've got taurine synthesis occurs in the liver, so from methionine or from cysteine. Remember, I showed you another diagram a moment ago. So these two key amino acids are necessary, and we have these metabolic pathways that require B vitamins, predominantly B6, 12, and folate, which is B9, to get to taurine. Now, once we get to taurine, we can talk about the liver now taking that taurine, right here, taurine, and helping to make bile acids, which are what these two compounds right here are. So these two are just fancy ways, fancy biochemical terms, but these are both bile acids. So we need that taurine to get to bile acids. Why do we need bile acids? Simply put, bile acids help humans absorb fat. So fat absorption is the key role. If you don't have adequate bile production, you become fat malabsorbed. That means you can be depleted in vitamins A, vitamins D, vitamins E, and vitamin K. You could also become depleted in omega-3, omega-6, and other fats. And so where does this apply? To many of you, this applies if you've had your gallbladder removed, right? So sitting on the back of the liver is the sac, the muscular sac called the gallbladder. The gallbladder secretes, you see the gallbladder right here, it's this green sac, and it secretes bile into the small intestine where it then emulsifies fat. So what does emulsification mean? If you've ever used soap, if your hands were ever greasy and you tried to wash them in water and the grease just wouldn't come off, and then you used a soap, and then the soap turns that grease on your hands into something that's water soluble. That's a form of emulsification. So think of fats as something that need to be turned into water, right? Fat-soluble vitamins and nutrients have to be turned into water-soluble nutrients so that they can be properly absorbed through your small intestine into your bloodstream. So if you don't have adequate bile, your ability to absorb those fats is going to be rendered less, right? You're going to potentially run into fat malabsorption, and that's again what leads to this problem. So we need taurine to make this soap, if you will, that helps us to absorb fat. And if you've had your gallbladder removed, This is why so many people with gallbladder surgery take bile salts. Bile salts orally, right? Because when you don't have a gallbladder, your ability to absorb fat becomes less efficient. Now, bile salts are supplements that can kind of overcome this. I produce something called Lipogest that we use all the time in our clinic for people that have had their gallbladders removed. So where might also this be important is those of you with a history of gluten sensitivity or celiac disease, because one of the hallmarks of celiac disease is fat malabsorption. And so what we commonly see in patients with celiac, because they have intestinal damage, they start malabsorbing nutrients. And this could also include malabsorbing vitamin B6 that's necessary to make the taurine, to make your bile acids, and other B vitamins as well. So we see celiac disease, the damage to the intestine can cause fat malabsorption, but so too can the vitamin deficiencies caused by the damage to the intestine can lead to that as well. So this is very common. Now, the other connection here is that many people with celiac disease develop something called non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, NAFL. There's also autoimmune hepatitis, which is linked to celiac disease as well. So a lot of these individuals that do have reactions to gluten have liver damage, and that liver damage can contribute to an inability to properly not only form bile, but also other problems associated with that liver damage. So bottom line, if you are gluten sensitive and you have struggled with gallbladder problems or liver problems, if you have lower right, kind of right here, this pain that comes across the intestinal over the liver area, and if you have right shoulder blade pain in the back, you may have, that's kind of a physical symptom of gallbladder or of liver dysfunction. It's never a bad idea if you're struggling with that, especially if you've got that history of gluten sensitivity, to get an ultrasound of your liver and gallbladder to get it checked out. Now, sometimes what happens is people will have sludge. Their doctor will say, oh, it looks like you have sludge in your gallbladder. Or, you know, or stones. So you can form gallstones. One of the causes of this sludge formation, of this gallstone formation, is taurine deficiency. So a lot of times what we'll see, people will have a follow-up with their GI doctor. Their GI doctor sends them to the surgeon. They want to have their gallbladder removed. What we encourage these people to do first is to consider taurine supplementation because it can definitely support healthy production of bile. We also encourage them to use vitamin C because this helps with it, as well as vitamin B6. In a perfect world, you would do nutritional testing, so you get testing done to measure deficiencies of these nutrients and then supplement accordingly before you just let a surgeon tear out your gallbladder and now you don't have one for the rest of your life. Now, I know that they try to tell you you have no real need for a gallbladder. You can live and survive without a gallbladder. Certainly you can. We know humans do survive without their gallbladder. However, it's not just about surviving. It's about thriving, and it's about being functionally, effectively healthy, right? So keep your organs. If you've been told this, consider vitamin B6, consider vitamin C, consider taurine as a potential to helping you out. And also definitely consider a gluten-free, grain-free diet. See this happen a lot. We have saved a lot of gallbladders over the last several decades in practice just by changing people's diets. So back to this diagram, a couple of other things I want to point out here. You'll see up here cholesterol. Cholesterol is the primary ingredient that helps you make bile acids. So you start with cholesterol, and then you have this gene called CYP7A1. This is a gene that upregulates the conversion of cholesterol into 7-alpha hydroxycholesterol, which then subsequently leads to bile formation. Now this pathway right here, you'll notice I've got this arrow coming in Vitamin A and vitamin D regulate the functionality of that enzyme in the conversion of cholesterol into bile and through a feedback mechanism. So vitamin A and vitamin D deficiency problems can actually increase the messaging that your liver needs to make more bile acids. Why? Because you need bile acids to absorb vitamin A and vitamin D. And that's what we think scientifically, is that when your vitamin A and vitamin D are low, your body tries to make more bile acids to help you to absorb. But if you don't have adequate taurine, and if you don't have adequate vitamin C or vitamin B6, it's going to be really hard to do. So there's multiple nutrients revolved around how your body produces bile acids, but because we're talking about taurine here today, taurine being one of the primary ingredients, cholesterol, those of you that have doctors that want to lower your cholesterol to below 100, bad idea for digestion. You need cholesterol to make bile acids. So food for thought here, definite food for thought. Don't just throw your functionality away over one opinion. It's always a good idea if you're facing a surgery to get a second opinion.